Okay, we have a report now from Manders Orebach. We hear from Steve Barron from Better Democracy New Zealand, which is an organisation that aims to encourage improvement of New Zealand's democratic system and encourage direct democracy through processes such as the veto and citizens-initiated referendum. Reporter Manders Orebach asked Mr Barron if he thinks it's actually realistic to think politicians would willingly give up some of their power to implement greater democracy.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Turkeys just don't vote for Christmas. There has to be pressure put upon them to lay themselves on the dinner plate. And I see this as an important step forward in our democracy. We no longer trust our politicians. Mostly we're happy to let them get on and do the job. We vote for them at election time based on general feelings of how they handle the economy, maybe one or two important policies, but that doesn't mean to say just because you vote for the national government or the Labor government that you agree with everything that government wants to do. You may be totally the opposite on some of their policies. And the advantages of direct democracy is that it allows you to cherry pick the policies and issues that are important to you.
Do you see any risks with all of this, though, that politicians would maybe get too eager to please and just reform to populist ideas and wouldn't be able to make those hard decisions that maybe is that you have to do if you're going to lead a country?
Well, that depends what you call democracy. Democracy isn't just voting once every 3 years. There are issues where the government is totally out of sync with what the public wants. And at the end of the day, they're our representatives. They're supposed to be representing us. And if the majority of us don't agree with what that government wants to do, then we should be able to stop them. At the end of the day, it's our country, and if that's what we want, that's what we should get.
So what would you say is the state of New Zealand democracy?
Well, my consideration is that New Zealand is suffering from a serious democratic deficit. First of all, we have no codified constitution, therefore no check and balance on what a government can do. Secondly, we have no upper house. The third systemic concern that I would have would be the free or conscience votes that we have in Parliament. The problem is when members of Parliament vote in a free vote, they don't necessarily represent the constituents in their electorates. A fourth concern for me would be international laws and free trade agreements, which are growing all the time. They take away the power of local laws. They bind us and give other nations and organisations a little bit too much control over the country. Personally, I feel very much like Switzerland that you shouldn't be allowed to enter into an international treaty of any particular length of time, say anything over 3 months, that without going to a referendum.
Brian Gould is spokesperson for Closing the Gap, and I asked him the same question. What is the state of our democracy?
People have, to some degree at any rate, lost faith in government and therefore in democracy as a form of government. And I think that's very regrettable, but I think it's because they sense that government and politicians generally no longer really have the power to help them very much. Reaching that view, I think that they're probably quite right. The current orthodoxy and position that many governments take and many politicians take is that really it's the market that has to prevail. The free market, as it's called, the unregulated market, they believe will always get the right answers. Now, not only is I think that wrong, but it is also, of course, a complete denial of the whole value of government and of the whole purpose of democracy. Now, if governments now say, oh no, you can't challenge the market, then there's no room left for government in reality, because the government will always have to defer to market outcomes. Now, that's a very extreme view that only very strident right-wingers will take. But if it's accepted by the general populace, or they're told that they must accept it, then they can't really see the point of voting in governments, because governments always have to do what they're told by very large corporations, and particularly by international corporations.
Would you say that big corporations themselves is a democratic problem?
Yes, I do. I mean, there are increasing instances of big corporations dictating to the governments of usually smaller countries, and we're certainly one of the smallest, dictating to them exactly what they have to do, even if it's against the interests and the wishes and the votes of the people who elect the governments of those countries. So the dominance of our world economy by an increasingly small number of very, very large corporations is actually very damaging to the whole concept of self-government and of democratic freedom to decide our own affairs. The TPPA and agreements like that are really just further steps being taken by major corporations to ensure that they get their way. Of course, sometimes we elect governments like our own at present, where you don't need a TPPA for our government just to roll over and do what it's told.
My own, maybe a little bit naive suspicion is, though, that it doesn't really matter what government we have when it comes to agreements like the TPPA, because if our government doesn't agree to it, we would miss out on a whole lot of trade and our economy would take quite a big hit. So we don't really have a choice whether or not we want to agree to the agreement or not. And I raised this concern with Mr. Gould.
In the end, people buy our goods because they want them. They don't buy them because we've signed agreements with them. They buy them because, as in the case of the Chinese, for example, who are very keen to have our dairy produce. The first thing you have to do is to separate out the notion of free trade from what's being proposed in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Free trade, as I say, depends on the willingness of both sides to trade with each other and to see some benefit in it, and nobody would object to that particularly. But what the TPPA is doing, and there's a similar enterprise underway in Europe, is to provide a sort of charter for major corporations so that they can have all the advantages of trading in our economy and operating in our economy on a basis that suits them. And if they find that our governments don't comply with what they want, they would, under a TPPA, be able to take our government to court, an international tribunal, specially set up for the purpose. We could well find that Pharmac, which keeps our drug prices down on prescription, we would be told by American corporations, drug companies, that was an unfair interference with free trade, and our government could be taken to a tribunal and made to drop that proposal. Even our Fonterra and Zespri cooperative primary production organizations could easily be challenged as being somehow an infringement of free trade. In other words, these agreements are nothing to do with free trade as such. They are to do with increasing the powers of international corporations to dictate to our governments, and therefore through our governments to us. We would lose huge ability to manage our own affairs, because if we tried to stand up for ourselves, we would find that our government was taken off to this international court.